Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, or good night, or whatever time of day it is for you as you're watching this right now. I'm David Heinen with the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits. And today we're going to talk a bit about the state budget, both where it is today. And today is the afternoon of May 10th, 2023, when this is being recorded, what the next steps in the process are, and kind of how the budget works and what is in the budget. So we're going to start by talking just some basics about the North Carolina state budget. Every 2 years, the biggest job that the North Carolina General Assembly has is to develop how the state is going to spend its money for the next 2 years. The state's fiscal year runs from July 1st through June 30th of the following year. So the upcoming fiscal year will start July 1 of 2023 and will go through June 30th of 2024. The legislature right now is in the process of developing a 2-year budget. So not only for that fiscal year, but for the full biennium, which is the 2 years. So starting on July 1, 2023 and going through June 30th, 2025. The budget will include a wide variety of spending things. The state constitution in North Carolina, along with almost every other state, requires that we have a balanced budget. That means that projected revenues, that's typically tax revenues, but also fees that come in, can't be less than what the total spending is. In other words, state spending cannot exceed expected revenues. We can't, the federal government, and we're seeing this right now, can have a deficit so that there can be more federal spending than there's revenue coming in. The federal government can take on debt. The state government in North Carolina can't do that. So one of the challenges that is always in place for the General Assembly is to develop a budget that is balanced, and that's something that is required. Sometimes there is extra revenue, just like nonprofits sometimes will plan for a balanced budget and maybe plan for a little bit of excess revenue. And when the state has excess revenue, that can go into reserves, or that is funding money that is available for the next year for legislators to reinvest in other state programs and services. So we're going to take a look at the General Assembly's website so we can take a look at kind of the budget process. The first step in the process is different subcommittees. So both the House and the Senate have appropriations committees that meet to discuss what the details of the budgets are going to look like. But within both the House and the Senate, there are a variety of subcommittees that talk about things. We're going to take a look at the House subcommittees. So in the House, there are subcommittees on agriculture and natural and economic resources, capital, education, general government, and that kind of category includes a variety of state agencies that don't quite fit into one of the other categories: health and human services, information technology, justice and public safety, and transportation. The two biggest areas of the state budget, and I should say that the Senate has very similar appropriation subcommittees as well. The two biggest areas of funding within the budget are education and health and human services. And frankly, those are the two areas where the majority of nonprofits that receive state funding through grants or contracts typically receive their funding. So if we click under the news and information area on the General Assembly's website, you'll see on their 2023 budget, and pretty much always there will be a tab for the current state year budget under there. And we're going to look at two documents in a moment. But before that, just kind of want to get us a kind of basics on the timeline. So typically, and it alternates with every 2-year period. So this year, the North Carolina House of Representatives starts the budget process. 2 years from now, the Senate will start it, and they alternate every biennium, which chamber initiates the budget process. So the House last month already passed its version of the budget. In fact, that was earlier than typically happens. Typically, because there were several $1 billion of excess revenue that were available, legislators knew that there would be sufficient state revenue available to fund with the level of state funding that the General Assembly leadership had agreed upon for the upcoming budget. So Typically, legislators wait until after individual income tax returns have been filed in mid-April so that they have a clearer sense of how much income tax revenue is available. Not an issue this year because, again, legislative leaders knew that there was going to be more revenue available regardless of what the actual income tax collection looked like in mid-April. So the House went ahead and got started and passed their budget in April, which was helpful. As I mentioned, the state budget takes effect on July 1 of each year. So the goal of the legislature is typically to have a budget in place by then. Like other pieces of legislation, the budget needs to be passed by both chambers. So the House has already passed its version of the budget. The Senate now will take up the budget. We'll get to that in a moment, kind of what that process is and what to look for in that. Probably starting next week, the week of May 15th, depending on maybe the current week and maybe in the past tense, depending on when you're viewing this. So the House and the Senate each pass their own version of the budget. So they typically have a fair number of differences between the two. So then the next step is they get together and have a conference committee where the House and Senate work out their differences and come up with one final version of the budget that is identical that both chambers then vote on and approve. It then goes to the governor, and Governor Cooper, the last couple of years, has signed the budget into law. Previously, he had vetoed the state budget. One difference between North Carolina and most other states, and also a difference between North Carolina and the federal government, is that a new law that was put into the State Budget Act a few years ago provides that in North Carolina, if the legislature and governor cannot agree on a budget and no budget is passed, rather than having to let either shut down parts of the state government, and we've seen that with the federal government sometimes, is that if Congress and the president can't agree on a budget, there'll be a shutdown of at least part of the federal government, or having to pass a continuing budget resolution, so kind of a short-term fix so that the budget continues in place for a fixed period of time to give adequate time for more negotiation between legislators and the governor in the budget. We don't have to do that in North Carolina because the budget just continues in place as it is. That means that there are no new appropriations, and that also means that if the population has grown, which has been happening in North Carolina for quite a while, when there are periods of inflation like what we have now, and if there are some changes in needs and communities that are across the state, that there's not an opportunity to fix that. But it also means that we don't have government shutdowns and don't have legislators having to negotiate a continuing resolution. So Governor Cooper, for a few years, had vetoed the budget, but the previous budget just stayed in place. It meant that there weren't many changes made to state funding, but it also didn't have dire consequences like there are elsewhere. So with that kind of background, the House has passed its version of the budget. The Senate is likely to release its version of the budget next week, and we'll probably vote on it. The process typically is that the budget is released, and we'll take a look at those documents. There are two documents that come out when either chamber releases its budget or when there's a conference committee budget comes out. And it's really helpful if you're tracking items in the budget. It's really important to look at both of those documents because they both contain very important information and sometimes complementary information to one another, and sometimes information that may only be available in one of the two documents. So it's really important to look at both of those. We'll get to those, take a look at those from the House budget in a moment. But just finishing up on the process then, the Senate will likely release its budget early next week and then have several committee meetings on it. So typically the Appropriations Committee has the longest meetings on the budget in each chamber. They go through not every line item, but the kind of big picture details of each area of the budget. The different committee chairs, subcommittee chairs who've helped design each part of the budget will take the lead on those. And there's an opportunity for members of the Appropriations Committee to offer amendments in the budget. Typically, the rules of the Appropriation Committees are that amendments have to be revenue neutral. So in other words, you can't add to total spending, and they also have to be revenue neutral within each area. And what that means is, for example, if a senator were proposing to provide a new direct appropriation to an education nonprofit for $5 million, they would need to find somewhere else within the education portion of the budget to reduce spending by $5 million. That's typically how it works. After the appropriation committee approves the budget, then typically the finance committee will look at it. The budget includes some tax provisions, and we'll get to that in a couple minutes as well. And then typically committees looking at pension programs, because so much of the budget affects state employees, so that there'll be discussion in that committee as well. And then finally, the rules committee in each chamber looks at the budget. Typically, that's a very brief discussion, and there's just kind of a formality. And then the budget gets 2 floor votes on separate days. The rules of the House and Senate require that each chamber vote on the budget twice. It's called second and third reading. The first reading happens when any bill is introduced, and it's not like a full reading of the bill, but just is a formality of the legislative process. But the second and third readings happen on different days. Sometimes, occasionally, some years it will happen kind of late in the day one day, and then very, very early in the morning the next day. But in the last couple of years, and I think what is likely to happen again in the Senate this year, is there'll be 2 consecutive days when the budget is read. And again, members have the opportunity to make amendments at that point. So that's kind of where we're at in the process. Taking a look at the contents of the budget. So I mentioned there are 2 documents. The first, which we're opening here, is called the committee report, or the money report of the budget. It kind of goes interchangeably by those 2 names. And as the name suggests, and I'm just pulling through here to get to the kind of some of the appropriations in there. It identifies within each subject area, and it goes through by subject areas, each appropriation, and identifies how much money is being appropriated for that. And at the beginning, as we were scrolling through very quickly, you saw some spreadsheets where it kind of aggregates things, and within each area, it aggregates things. So just pulling up a page, and this is within the education budget, which is the first part, so we'll get into that first. You can see that if numbers are in parentheses, that means that is a reduction in how much funding is being appropriated, and any number that is not in parentheses, but it's just a plain number. I'm just trying to define one where there's a page where there are some good things for that. It is an increase in funding or new funding for a program. If you see an R next to it, and the budget has it for both fiscal years, so you see 2 columns in the money report, one for the first fiscal year 2023-24, and one for the second fiscal year 24-25. And often it'll be the same amount, but sometimes it'll only be in 1 year or another year. If there is an R after that amount, that means it is recurring funding. That means that it is funding that will continue to be available each year after that, and is kind of automatically rolled into the next budget. If there is an NR next to it, that means non-recurring or one-time funding. So that's often funding that comes, we saw a lot of that in the last couple of budgets, when there was a lot of federal money that came in through COVID relief programs like the American Rescue Plan Act and the CARE Act, that was allocated to one-time funding, some of it for state programs, some of it for local governments, and much of it for nonprofits. So that's kind of what to look for. My suggestion, if you're looking for particular things in the budget, is to go ahead and do a word search within the money report to see that, and it gives you a good sense of that. And the money report was 640 pages, so again, it's probably not something you're going to read, in 15 minutes and get through the whole thing. So we're going to close out the money report and look at the second budget document, which is the budget itself, the legislative text. It's called the bill text in here. And this looks, if you've seen bills in the General Assembly, this will look very familiar to you. The format of the bill text of the state budget is just like other bills. Again, it has kind of some aggregated data on appropriations and revenue at the beginning of the document. And this document, rather than identifying each line item in the budget and kind of having a one paragraph description, a one sentence description like the money report does, this goes into more of the policy that's included in the budget. So sometimes there are a lot of rules that are set forth in the budget. Some of them are applicable across state government, some of them to one particular area of state government or one agency. Some of them apply to nonprofits. And some of them aren't really budget related at all, but are the policy changes. So this has a kind of a wide variety of stuff in this. Some things are kind of boilerplate that are in the budget every single year. Others are new policies. So typically in this document, when you see language that is underlined, that is making a change to a current state law. So for example, this is in the House budget to pass. This language on medical freedom, COVID-19 vaccinations is looking at rules that creating a new rule that prohibits discrimination by state agencies, and there's also one for local governments based on vaccination status against COVID for people. So that would be a new provision that was included in the House budget, a new law that's in there, and that text is underlying. So just again, if you're looking at the budget and looking for particular things in there, particularly policy things, it's worth doing a word search and perhaps a few different word searches. So, for example, the center is looking for things that affect nonprofits. So obviously we'll do a word search for nonprofit, for tax exempt, for 501c3, but we also look for things like non-state because often nonprofits are characterized as non-state entities, and there are some laws, reporting requirements, other laws that apply to non-state entities that apply to nonprofits. Do a variety of other word searches too for things that we think might be in the budget that are of interest. Kind of substantively then, so that's kind of where we are on the budget. And again, the conference budget will come out this year. There's a strong plan to have the budget signed into law, or if Governor Cooper were to veto the budget, have his veto overridden and in place by the end of June, because Medicaid expansion is tied to the budget, and the federal funding that the state gets for having Medicaid fund expansion in place is tied to the budget being in place. So there's a real impetus to have that budget done by June 30th. Typically, the budget is later than that, and that often creates problems for nonprofits too. So if nonprofits have provide services through contract with the state, often state agencies can't get a contract signed and into place until the budget's certified. And even after the budget is signed into law, it still takes a couple of months for the Office of State Budget Management to certify the budget. So it can take months and months and months. So a couple of years ago, when the budget was not signed into law until November, nonprofits weren't getting their contracts for periods that started back in July. They weren't getting it until the next January or February at the earliest. So that was a big problem. So hopefully with the budget in place in time this year, that means nonprofits will get their contracts signed this summer. So a few, again, substantive provisions in the budget. The appropriations are in there. The money report's the main place to go for specifics on the appropriation. There are policy changes throughout the budget. So we're looking at that COVID vaccination requirement language that was in the House budget. There will be many policy provisions. Again, some of them affecting appropriations, but some of them not. Some of them, other unrelated things. Often those are provisions that were included in other legislation that was considered during the session or hadn't been considered during the session. Often legislators will file bills, independent bills separate from the state budget that will have appropriations, and then many of those, but not all of them, are ultimately included in the state budget. And most funding that happens at the state legislature, most of those appropriations are done through the state budget, not through separate appropriations. So in addition to appropriations and policy changes, the budget also typically has a variety of tax law changes. So we're going to And those show up in the budget document itself and towards the end of the document. So we're just going to take a look at the House budget that was passed to see those. And those could include changes to tax rates. So we'll take a look at that. So for example, and they're listed as finance provisions. So for example, in the House budget, it is cutting the individual income tax rate for the year 2025 in 2024 from 4.6% to 4.5%, and increasing the standard deduction and zero tax bracket, the amount before people pay taxes. Also adding a variety of tax credits in the budget. The Senate budget is likely to have steeper tax rate cuts and probably some other tax law changes. Sometimes those can be things that affect nonprofits. For example, I know many of you have reached out a couple of weeks ago to your House members to get them to co-sponsor a bill that would change nonprofit sales tax refund, which is creates a lot of red tape for nonprofits to treat sales tax exemption. That's a provision that could be included in the state budget. So again, that's another provision in the budget. And then finally, one last category of thing that's in the budget are earmarks. So those would be, and there were a lot of those in the budget the last few years when there was a lot of federal money for COVID. There could be more this year. They most often show up in the conference report of the budget, so we'll probably see those in June. And those are often direct appropriations, typically one time, so they'll have an NR next to them. Appropriations to a specific entity, and usually they're either for a local government, so for a county or a city or town, or for a nonprofit. So a lot of the direct appropriations for nonprofits are included as earmarks in the budget. One question we get a lot at the center, and I think this is something that we get because there is a process in Congress, but how do you apply for an earmark in the budget? And the answer is you don't. Most members of Congress, so the federal budget, there is a process, there's a more formal process for earmarks, and most members of Congress have an application process, and then you can request to get an earmark in the federal budget. In the state budget, that's not how it works. Many decades ago, there was actually a formula, and each legislator got a certain amount of earmarks for their district, based on whether they were in the majority party or minority party, and their seniority in the legislature, et cetera. Now there's not a process for it, but instead, in some legislative districts, and it's often those districts, people who are in leadership or people maybe who are on the fence about voting for the budget, there are direct appropriations for them. There's not an application process for that. But often, what we've heard is that legislators are more likely to direct an appropriation to a nonprofit if they are familiar with the organization, perhaps if they've taken a tour of the organization or know somebody who's on the board there and have been contacted by them. So it's not a formal ask, but it's sometimes kind of what is the first thing that they think of when they're thinking about needs within their district. So there's good reason for nonprofits that might want to someday get a legislative earmark to make sure that you've reached out to your elected officials and you get to know them. There's no transparency in the budget process, even to identify who requested an earmark. So it's often kind of mysteriously shows up, and there's not a clear answer for that. So hopefully that's helpful to understand the budget process. And again, kind of the next steps we can look for are the Senate to come out with their budget. There'll again be two documents like the two we're seeing here for the House, a money report and a budget text document. And then once the Senate passes its budget, and it will pass its budget, the House and Senate will get together, have that conference committee. They're usually not formal public meetings. It's more negotiated between the House and Senate. And typically the House and Senate appropriations subcommittee chairs who work on each portion of the budget really kind of negotiate on any differences between their portion. And then they'll come out with the final conference committee budget. And probably within a day or so of when that is released, it will be 11 or 1,200 pages of between the two documents. Both the House and Senate will vote on it. And then after that, if Governor Cooper, is comfortable with the budget, that never anything, a budget document that there's always something that anybody likes and something that anybody does not like in the budget. But if Governor Cooper decides to sign it into law, then it will become law. If not, the General Assembly will vote to override its veto. And because there are super majorities in both chambers, it is extremely likely that if Governor Cooper were to veto the budget, it'll be overridden and become law. And one last note mentioning Governor Cooper, the first part of the budget process, which is kind of a formality, but the governor does propose a recommended budget, and that comes out typically in the spring of each year. So Governor Cooper recommended his budget shortly before the House passed its budget. His budget recommended a little bit higher spending levels. The legislature has no obligation to follow anything in the governor's budget. It's more recommendations, but because many parts of the state government are agencies that fall underneath the governor, it makes a lot of sense for the governor to have an opportunity to provide input on what priorities should be and what spending priorities should be. One last part of the budget process is not an immediate thing, but because the legislature does pass a 2-year budget, they don't have, like the rest of us, they don't have foresight to know what the world is going to bring for North Carolina over the next 12 months. And things can change. The economy can change. There can be natural disasters in the state. A few years ago, there was a pandemic that occurred between when the 2019 through 21 budget was passed right in the middle of there. And circumstances can really change and needs can change. So there's an opportunity in the short session, which is the second year of the legislative session, which typically starts somewhere between late April and mid-May. The legislature can then make adjustments to the second year of the budget. So they can, if revenue is better than expected and there's some additional needs, they can include additional appropriations. If there are some things where there are revenue challenges or maybe some needs have shifted, they can eliminate or reduce appropriations for the second year of the budget. And also there can be additional policy changes in there. So that's something to look for next year. And it's really difficult to know what the process and what the substance of that is going to look like, because it's so dependent on what has changed in between. So that's a quick, fairly quick overview of the state budget. Hopefully it's helpful for you, and good luck if your nonprofit is appropriating for appropriations or other provisions within the state budget, getting what you want. As always, if you have additional questions, if you get the policy updates from the center on Friday, you can always respond to that or contact me however other way you'd like to do so. I'm happy to share that. So with that, we're going to end this discussion of the state budget. Thanks for listening.